Good evening. My name is Amanda Brown, and I teach third grade at Roosevelt Magnet School here in Peoria. And the title of my talk is When the Brain is the Enemy. All men who go to war die, kid. Anybody who comes back, well, they came back cheated. Rich remembers the hardened GI in the poorly lit bunker that stunk of smoke, strong alcohol, and vomit, assaulting his senses the first night of deployment. War has stuck with him all these years. The smell of death and the machines that caused it, with noises so loud you feel like an ant under a lawnmower. On the best days, he tells himself it was kill to survive. On his worst, his mind tells himself he committed acts of madness so as not to go mad. In some sense, the grudges held close to his heart will keep him at war for the rest of his life. At war with his actions, at war with his survival, at war with the system. Mood swings and volatility have cost him his marriage. Invasive memories pervade his thoughts, and he finds himself battling and balling up his fists when he gets angry. Although he came back, he's never escaped. Although he survived, how much of him died in the swamp? He may have cheated death, but just like that GI prophetically said in the smoke-fueled haze so many years before, Richfield's life has cheated him. For this courageous, vulnerable veteran, the brain is the enemy. Institutionalized in a Russian orphanage following parental abandonment, Ben can vividly remember the neglect of his childhood. Following his adoption at age 7, Ben became a member of a loving, wealthy American family with a multitude of resources available to him. A fourth grade student at a prestigious private academy, his teacher provided individualized instruction with a host of support staff. Yet Ben is frequently defiant and has an alarming lack of empathy. The paperwork encompassing a plethora of diagnoses expands his file as mental and educational professionals work to identify what's wrong with him. As he sits in the principal's office, once again, Ben begins to cry in bewilderment of why he is there, genuinely unable to connect his impulsive impulses to the consequences of his actions. For this enigmatic, intelligent child, the brain is the enemy. Jesse slams his locker door shut and picks up his breakfast bag. A deep yellow bruise on his cheek shows signs of fading. The third grader sidles up to his teacher for a hug, then seconds later corners a student in the bathroom to steal his gloves. When asked in class about the missing gloves, Jesse's expression goes blank and he becomes unresponsive. He opens a classroom closet, climbs in on a shelf, and pulls the door behind him. Emily enters her primary level classroom, slamming her books down on the desk. Turning to a student nearby, Emily begins shrieking at him to stop looking at her with his ugly self. She snatches up her belongings and storms from the room. Encountering a group of 7th graders in the hallway, she begins screaming similar accusations at them. Tension becomes heated until a teacher steps in to intervene and walk Emily away. Cabron sits quietly at a table, working on multiplication problems. Mathematics is his strong area, and he loves demonstrating his solutions with creative strategies. As the teacher moves toward the board to explain a solution, she's startled by Cabron darting across the classroom and tackling a student in the hallway. When the commotion is settled, Cabron responds to questions about his behavior with the sullen comment, "That kid looked at me and wiggled his finger." Kiesia fiddles with a basket of books, knocking them off her desk, which spills the contents to the floor. She gets up too boisterously, banging her chair as she moves to clean up the mess. James walks toward his desk, the volume of his voice just a little too loud for inside. As Kiesia attempts to join the rest of the class at the rug, her shoulder brushes against James. He erupts in rage, shouting, "Why'd you do that?" and kicking his desk to the floor. Kiesia shrieks back, I didn't mean to. I want to leave this school, and collapses in an emotional heap on the floor. James turns toward the wall of the classroom, fists tightly balled as he repeatedly kicks the wall. For these beautiful young children, the brain is the enemy. Just as the trauma of war physically altered Rich's brain, even as early childhood neglect detrimentally changed the development of Ben's mind, so too the chronic trauma of these urban school children has changed the very structure of their brains. You see, Jesse, Emily, Cabron, Kiesia, and James are my students. These stories occurred on the first half hour of a typical school day this morning. Emotions help steer our reasoning toward the knowledge that is relevant to a current situation or problem. Emotion is triggered by thoughts, which play out in body and mind. Bodily sensations contribute to feelings, which can in turn then influence thoughts. Rational thought, which we often think of as cognition, informs emotional thought, and where they join is the platform for decision-making, memory, learning, and creativity. When educators fail to appreciate and acknowledge the importance of students' emotions, we fail to appreciate a vital force in students' learning. These days in education, there's a lot of talk about the importance of learning targets. Students need to take ownership of what they're aiming to learn and then know when they've hit that target. Many an educator can tell stories of what happens when a student's learning target agenda doesn't align with the teacher's. The temptation in this situation can be to tell a student, fix your attitude, or sit down, you're going to learn it anyway. The truth is, if a student's emotions aren't invested, profitable learning isn't going to occur. One could argue, in fact, by forcing this emotion here, cognitive thinking there dichotomy, we as educators fail to appreciate the very reason students learn at all. For children, stress can go a long way. A little bit provides a platform for learning. When a young baby first reaches out for that block that's just out of grasp, the stress of the productive challenge promotes healthy development. But a lot of stress, chronic toxic stress like poverty, abuse, and neglect, can have lasting negative impacts. Research suggests that chronic stress may lead to problems regulating emotions as an adult. These individuals show less activity in areas of the prefrontal cortex, which orchestrates our thoughts and actions. Greater activity happens in the amygdala. Can't really see it there, but it's in the green. The brain's emotion and fear center, which triggers that fight, flight, or freeze response that we're aware of when we encounter something that scares us. Messages from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex are often balanced by input from a third area, the hippocampus, which helps decide whether something is truly dangerous. An example of this would be when you're at home watching a movie, a scary movie. Your amygdala is telling you that you should have fear as a response to the story. But your hippocampus can tell the prefrontal cortex, you're at home, there's no zombies here, you're safe. In students with chronic childhood trauma, the skill of scanning for danger is highly developed. The amygdala is often larger, which makes it more likely to flood the body with that automated fight or flight response to danger. Additionally, the hippocampus is often smaller for children with early childhood trauma, which means there's fewer messages balancing that input from the amygdala. Both common sense and decades of research tell us children cannot learn until they feel safe and able to understand and manage their own emotions. It's been said, we feel, therefore we learn. Ultimately, then, we think in the service of an emotional goal, namely to maintain and promote internal balance and thus ultimately life. Thinking back to learning targets, These emotional goals can manifest in academics, even for a teenager like Jeremy. What happens when the brain isn't on board? When the brain unwittingly is the enemy? When the stress response is triggered too frequently, such as experiences of chronic trauma, the body becomes conditioned to employ those survival strategies as a regular way of being. Even when dangers are not present, children may react as though they are. Children who have experienced chronic trauma simply can't move from and remove their lens of perception when they go from home to school, from dangerous place to safe place. This stress reaction is automatic and occurs outside their conscious thinking, and we as educators see behaviors that are a response to feelings our students can't name or describe. For socially evolved humans, emotional pain is perceived as acutely as physical pain. These students enter the classroom with an unnamed and unconscious target to avoid the pain or danger that they constantly perceive is present. We see this objective often sabotage their ability to learn, to behave appropriately, or even to understand positive messages from the safe school environment. As educators, we'd probably call Jesse's behaviors abnormal. Emily's hypersensitivity might be referred to as atypical. James' rage and Kieja's overly emotional response definitely wouldn't fit within the definition of what's average. And we see from brain scans to a certain extent that these are outside what is considered the range of neurologically typical. At my school, these behaviors are the norm. Some might point to discipline or classroom management issues. Others might herald it as another example of our society's degeneration. These factors may play a role. Then again, is it possible that we as educators need a mind change? In the late 1990s, an adverse childhood experiences study measured what the researchers referred to as adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. For every yes a participant answered regarding items like abuse, neglect, parental mental illness or substance abuse, parental incarceration, a point was attributed to their ACE score. Researchers found that the higher your ACE score, the higher your chances of negative later health outcomes. For a person with an ACE score of 4 or more, even with high-risk factors like smoking accounted for, the risk of heart disease was 2.5 times greater as someone with an ACE score of 0. For depression, it was 4.5 times. For suicide, 12 times. High doses of chronic trauma not only change the brain structure, they also affect our immune and hormonal systems and even change our DNA. Of course, this makes sense, right? If you have a bad childhood, it's going to impact you as an adult. But how many of us could raise our hands if asked such a question about our childhood? Did you have a parent who drank a little too much? Believed that sparing the rod actually did spoil the child? Was there a member of your family who suffered from mental illness? While we're tempted to associate these stats with a certain zip code or demographic, it's striking to note that 70% of participants in the original ACEs study are Caucasian, 70% are college educated. In fact, ACEs are extremely common. 67% of participants had at least one ACE. Imagine for a moment the number of times the letter E appears in a book compared to all the other letters. That's the same ratio, 1 in 8, of the people who had 4 or more ACEs. The ACEs study reveals a society where adverse childhood experiences are far more the norm than we likely realize or maybe even want to admit. When the brain is the enemy, you are unique. But aren't we all? The natural infinite variation of the human genome reveals our neurodiversity. No two brains are alike. For students with chronic trauma, there is hope. If we work to create a system authentic enough to acknowledge that what we're doing now isn't working for those most vulnerable in our classrooms. If we work to create a system that is holistic and sensitive to the individual in practice, not just in theory. If we work to create a system where demonstrating priority for emotional health means action, not just verbal jargon. Children are resilient, and the brain's neuroplasticity reveals an amazing ability to change and grow. There is hope if we as educators can work to see what honoring diversity truly means, especially for those whom the brain is the enemy. Thank you.